All right, so it's 3 p.m. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are all set to begin with another stimulating session on connecting the dots. First of all, I would like to thank our esteemed speakers for being part of this panel discussion. Welcoming Dr. Brilliant SK, CPO, Head Places and Processes, Times Pro. Mr. Colin Mendes, Head Human Resources, Voltas Beco. Miss Tina Matthew, Head Human Resources, NSCIT. Miss Sindhu Kalyanasundaram, Director and Founder, Ignite Academy and Server Happiness. Digital transformations, economic uncertainty, and political tensions have led to much disruption and change. As such, organizational design and change management remains a top priority for CHROs, especially now as organizations are seeing the fallout of too much change and uncertainty. HR leaders must help employees to navigate change and mitigate the impact that change may have on their work and, more importantly, their well being. Our esteemed panelists would share their views on this insightful topic, organizational design and change management. HRAI welcomes you all on the session on the session on connecting the dots. To know more about HRAI and its events, I would request all our participants to visit the link and details posted in the chat window. It would be great to have all the participants' feedback. We will be running a poll before the Q&A session. I request all the participants to kindly give your feedback on the session. I now take the privilege to introduce our moderator for the session, Ms. Sindhu Kalyanasundaram, Director and Founder, Ignite Academy and Server Happiness. Strong filter coffee, a book, rains, soulful music, great conversations. This is the perfect combination for a fantastic day, believes Sindhu. A speaker and entrepreneur who runs two ventures, Ignite Academy and Server Happiness, Sindhu is extremely passionate about working with people and creating happy and effective organizations. With a management consulting and business strategy background, today her companies have helped organizations across the country in enhancing their culture, people effectiveness, and creating a sense of belonging. You can follow her on LinkedIn. The link for the same has been shared in the chat window. Without wasting much time, I will hand over the platform to Ms. Sindhu now.
Thank you, Faisal. Thank you, HRAI. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be back on this platform. A very happy new year. And we really wish this new year brings in a lot of positive, constructive change. And that's something very special about HRAI, because every time I'm in an HRAI panel discussion, I get to learn something. Today, however, the learning began quite early. I learned a new word, and the new word is called a horologist. So anyone who knows who a horologist is? Anyone? I'll probably give you 5 seconds without Googling. Okay, so a horologist is someone who collects watches. Okay, so I got to know about that word today, and you will see one of the panelists smiling as I mention this word. So a horologist is someone who collects watches. So imagine a person who collects watches. Imagine a person who collects vintage fountain pens, so much so that this person also has a collection starting from the Hero 330 series. It's my privilege to welcome the first panelist, Brilliant, who is the Chief People Officer and the Head of Places and Processes at Times Pro. So a little trivia about Brilliant. He is also modeled for the fresh face of Times of India. So doesn't that picture actually reflect that? Yeah, Colin's giving a thumbs up for that. Lovely. So that's a little bit trivia about Brilliant. He's extremely passionate about supporting and working with the underprivileged people, and he really wants to get them placed and get a foothold in the corporate sector. So we wish you all the best for such a noble gesture. Thank you so much for being a part of this panel, Brilliant. Brilliant's favorite song is Summer of 69 from Bryan Adams. So if you want to know anything about Brilliant on the professional side, you can follow him on LinkedIn. His LinkedIn profile has just been put on the chat window. Thank you for joining us, Brilliant.
Thank you. My pleasure to be a part of this. Thank you, Sindhu.
Great. Something that I discovered this morning was I had something very common with all the three panelists. So yes, Brilliant is a Toastmaster and so am I. I was so delighted to see that. I now take the pleasure in welcoming our second panelist, who is an avid traveler and an explorer. And I do a lot of traveling as well. In fact, this person just got back from an unexplored place around Morocco. So a traveler, an explorer, an avid travel blogger. It's our pleasure to welcome Colin Mendes. He loves the song Memories from Maroon. Maybe you can hum or sing that song for us sometime in the next 45 minutes, right? So that'll be good. Some unknown trivia about Colin is he's also a salsa dancer, if we can call you that, or he attempted salsa on the stage sometime back. But his LinkedIn profile says something very interesting that I'm going to actually read it out verbatim. One of the biggest contributors to long-term success for an employee takes place much before they start working for us. I think that pretty much sums up what the essence of the entire HR fraternity is, or what the essence of leadership is actually, to get to know people much before they join the organization. He's also won the Great Manager Award of 2017. Colin's the head of HR at Voltas Beko. Thank you very much for joining us, Colin. It's a pleasure having you with us today.
Hey, thank you so much, Sindhu. It's absolutely a pleasure to be with all of you today. And, thanks for the kind introduction. Truly loved it. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we move on to our third interesting panelist. She looks subtle, but then what if I tell you that she is into martial arts, right? Tina, a fitness freak, someone who's also learning the ancient martial arts called Kalaripayattu, which is very popular in Kerala, in deep Kerala. And I was thrilled when she said that she's into that. A little bit trivia about Tina, which will actually take you into how objective her mindset is. So apparently when she was getting the certification on paragliding, where she was standing on top of the mountain and looking at the sunset, and when she was about to go and dive in, she realized that she did not carry that speaker which connects her and the person who was certifying it. While all of us would actually be panicking and thinking about our last moments, I think Tina was right there thinking about whether her insurance covered her. So Tina, I really haven't seen anyone think so objectively. I think this is what they say, thinking objectively even during crisis. So I'll never forget this example. Tina is the head of HR for NSEIT. She is a hardcore Marvel fan, so much so that even her HRIS implementation was named after a Marvel character. Thank you very much, Tina, for joining us. She is also the top 100 TA Pi Young Leader HR awardee for 2021. It's a pleasure having you with us today. So,
thank you, Sindhu. And what an energizing start for the day.
Thank you, Tina. And like we always say, we talk a lot about change. We have change, and I don't want to go about mentioning the quote of change, which is very cliche, but something that's irrefutable or something that's been a part of our lives for almost 3 years now is the fact that there's been no permanency in whatever we did. We thought life would continue in a certain manner, and we were disrupted. We got adapted to a new form of life that got disrupted. And then we thought we came back to normal, and that turned out to be a new normal. And suddenly we realized that there's nothing permanent. And suddenly wisdom dawned in us, and we all feel so enlightened. We feel scared. We feel insecure. But we also have a certain sense of calmness permeating within us, because change is something that's become an integral part of life. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking today about: changes in organizations. What are the different changes we are encountering in organizations? What are some stories that panelists can share to us about changes that they have encountered? What are the challenges they are facing, and what can we take away in terms of implementers of change? So I would like to ask the first question to Brilliant. We all know that there's a lot of change that's being implemented in organizations. How do you get your employees ready for such changes?
Thank you, Sindhu, for that question. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, from whichever part of the world you may have joined in. Thanks for joining in. Reminded me of a very old advertisement which said, "Sare ghar ke badal dalunga." Change is not that easy. If it was easy, then we would not have required professionals and practitioners to come up with ideas, processes, and thoughts. It requires not just consistent messaging, but also requires continuous engagement and a smooth process adoption if we need to drive outcomes. One of the challenges that we have seen all through is that you come up with a plan and then boom, the execution level, it fails. That's the sad part. So if I were to look at it from an organization standpoint, if I were to keep my employees engaged and connected in communicating the organizational change, I would say we should make the cut. CUT. C stands for continuous engagement. Now, continuous engagement, because change is a sort of a disruption. And disruption, believe it or not, it's make or break for organization and for teams. And to make the change effective as HR practitioners, we should ensure there is engagement right from the start, making sure that we go top to bottom. Start from the manager of managers, then the managers, then the individual contributors, making sure every aspect of engagement is covered, making them feel valued as a part of the entire process. Then comes the U. And this is something which I felt was interesting. It is upbeat communication. We have all heard about communication, but I want to make it upbeat because communication at times becomes so mundane, so routine, and so transactional. As my boss keeps saying, if you have sent this email from XYZ ID, I'm sure that people would not read it. So how do you make it upbeat? How do you make sure that the lack of connect during the communication is not there? I would say we need to take a step forward, positively communicate the need for change. Yes, we know there are challenges. We know it will not be easy. Focus on all the good things to look forward to. Make sure there is a lot of noise around the good change that is coming in. If you remember in the good old days when a phone company changed from orange to red to pink, there was a huge hullabaloo raised about how the change is good for people. And I think that's a very good way of communicating and upbeat communicating, I would say. Creating a picture of why it is important and how it helps you, how it helps me, how it helps the organization. And most important, it needs to be direct, honest, and very clear. Simple language, no jargons. We as professionals get used to so many jargons, right? First it was VUCA, now it's BANI. I don't know what will come up next, but cut the crap. Let's focus on being simple, to the point. And last but not the least is the T, which is the time investment. Unfortunately, many of us forget about the time element and we don't invest in having that conversations with people who are curious, anxious, and probably some of them are excited, but they don't know how to support the change that is coming through. So as managers, as leaders, we need to ensure that we give employees time so that they come to a level of understanding and get the grips of why the change is important. And I would say that's the best way we can connect. Make sure in the hybrid world today, we make time for both the online as well as the offline people. Many a times the communication is directed in a sense that you go out and address people, the connect is very strong, but we tend to forget people who are online. So I think creating that balance will help. So CUT, continuous engagement, upbeat communication, and time investment can definitely help. Back to you, Sindhu.
Thank you. Brilliant. I must say, I'm sure you must have heard this phrase a lot of times, considering your name is that way. That was a brilliant start to the panel discussion. I read one recommendation that someone had read for you or had written for you on LinkedIn was that the last letter T is silent in your name. And I can't agree more with the way you started CUT. In fact, when you were talking about upbeat communication, I was just reminded of a very small incident, and I tend to agree with you, especially when you say that when emails go out from a certain automated inbox, you can be assured that employees are not going to read that because they are so impersonal. I remember when we generally roll out these culture and happiness measurement surveys, and there was one organization which rolled out the survey, and my team was sitting here trying to find out how many responses we were getting, and it was abysmal. And then we realized that the email communication was going from an automated inbox. So we just asked the HR person to customize and send it personally from their inbox, signed personally by that head of HR. And within, I think, an hour, we got close to 140 responses following in. So I truly agree with you when you say communication has to be upbeat and more so really personal. So thank you for that brilliant start. So when you come with upbeat communication, you talked about continuous engagement, you talked about time. Now, all these will then translate into something that has to be measured, because being in the business of business, everything has to be objective and measurable. So my question to Colin is, what sort of KPIs will you then incorporate to measure change?
Thanks, Indu. In fact, along with various businesses, HR has been going through a lot of change in the recent past, and today we all see a large focus on digital HR, a large focus on continuous learning, and Billion already spoke about continuous engagement, but that's also very, very critical. And also today there's a large focus on wellness, because these are areas where we've seen a shift in the scale that's moved in that direction. Yeah. And to my mind, it is important for us to focus on measuring overall impact, and therefore KPIs, as which is often said, that what gets measured gets done. And we look at various KPIs that are really monitored during an entire change progress. Yeah, process. Yeah, so for me, performance results are the most critical, and most board will review performances every quarter, on a half-yearly basis, on an annually basis. Listed companies will have to publish these, and you will see trends that will emerge out of that, whether it is moving upwards or downwards or so on and so forth. Some of these, to my mind, are lag measures, and I come from a projects background in my previous assignment, and I'm a firm believer that it's not about only looking at lag measures, but also looking at about various milestones. Okay, milestones which actually would be key matrices that where we are able to monitor progress, and this, to me, will actually end up delivering project success. So whenever you're working on a project, and I'm saying this is irrespective of project that we're talking about, whatever the type of project, look at various milestones that you're able to measure at different points in time and culminate that into the larger picture. And if you want to deliver project success, each milestone, each movement in the milestone will actually deliver small success for people who are working on a project. I've worked on projects that have gone on for a long term, projects which go on for years. Sometimes it spills over into the next financial year and the next financial year. So maybe projects up to two financial years. So how do you celebrate achievements of people in that sense? So in an HR context, and I understand there would be a number of HR audience, some of the lead indicators that I would possibly look at, particular when you're running a project from an overall KPI perspective, how much adherence has been to the project plan? Yeah. How much of time has gone in how much of deviation has taken place? These are broad aspects to look at, whether your project is on track, needs intervention, needs correction, needs course correction, if any, or really needs to be completely overhauled. If you look at, various other aspects from an HR perspective, particularly when you're driving a lot of intervention in your organization, given the various changes that are happening, what is you look at training that has evolved in the last in the recent past? What is your ROI on training interventions that you're actually delivering? Is that actually becoming more meaningful, or are we doing more of what others are doing? Is it more meaningful for my audience? Is it relevant, and so on and so forth? look at, look at another aspect of communication, and how effective has communication been, in the recent past. Are we all very savvy with digital mode of communication? Do we need a hybrid format? Do we need to use different models of communication? Are voice notes now a preferred method of communication? So these are various things when we are looking at change. How are we measuring various aspects of what we are changing in the entire process? Yeah. Look at, employee engagement for that matter. How has engagement really moved on, and so on and so forth. And lastly, before I'd like to conclude, I want to mention that, above all, it's important to share lessons and learnings of experience. Yeah, because that will enable you to deliver better in future. So if I've done something well, or if I've probably not done something as good, look at those particular KPIs and how can I really fix those KPIs as I prepare a project for the second. So for example, I've delivered a project well, certain things have gone really well, certain things have probably not done well. What are those indicators that are there that will help me deliver my next project far more bigger, far more better, and far more impactful?
Thank you very much, Colin. I think that was extremely comprehensive, and some that can actually be project agnostic. For example, when you say adherence to project plan, it doesn't matter whether it's an infrastructure project or an IT consulting project, or just a project where you're actually changing the culture. It's more about, am I on track? And I think sometimes even non-adherence to the project plan can be a revelation. To understand, hey, it was actually good that we didn't adhere to it. Sometimes,
absolutely,
it can bring that out. So that's wonderful. Thank you. Now, because you said that, there's one very interesting story that struck my mind, especially when you spoke about measurement of success, to know, especially certain projects that span across a couple of financial years. How do you keep tracking? And I think a classic case for this would be the story of Tanishq, where Tata's entered into the jewelry market. And of course, they must have had their own KPIs. And then when they realized that the 18 karat gold strategy was not working, maybe the way they envisioned the entire company could have changed. That's when they introduced a new concept called a carat meter in the stores, which then got people to bring the jewelry that they had at home to the Tanishq stores and measure the purity of gold. That is a classic example of change management, because here you're actually changing a customer's mindset to move away from their traditional family goldsmiths to a corporate which is actually telling you that I'm going to test the purity of gold that you have trusted so far. And that was a complete change in the way consumers then started looking at corporates and built trust and faith. And that's a great example of how a company incorporated change management in terms of consumer behavior and became a success. That called for a lot of adaptability within the organization, because employees also had to be convinced about it. So my question for Tina is then, how would you ensure your organizational design fosters this sort of adaptability amongst everyone?
So when you're looking at change management, of course, there are multiple things that are taken into consideration, right? You almost be reading books and case studies on GE and everybody and how they adapt the 7 S's, etc., to get it done. But what's very clear is, as you mentioned, that main keyword of adaptability, and how does that agility actually come into the foray. And for that, I'd like to, reinforce it with the example of how Netflix really bought out. So Netflix, I'm sure, must be surprisingly for most of you, those who are on the call, you must be thinking that it's some organization that has come up recently, but they've been there right since the 90s. And this is an organization that was in the space of delivering DVDs home. So that was a time when people had CDs, etc. But with streaming coming into the place and with technology building in that direction, they really caught up to that drive, even though they are cannibalizing into their own market space. All right, they still froze up those old behaviors and they involved or they introduced newer behaviors and they encouraged it within the system. And that is why the organization was able to adapt to the technological change. And despite them cannibalizing into their space, they've grown almost 400 times their size in the last decade. And it's a case study that everybody talks about, right? So that is a classic example of how adaptability really helps in change management. And it's still a modest size of 5,000 employees, which is there I think somewhere in 2019. But despite that, they've been able to actually adapt themselves and really move up the value chain. So it's a very key important element where if leadership is able to really unfreeze the old behaviors and encourage newer behaviors to come into the system, then adaptability is something that will pick up. And these are case studies of how organizations are able to really take it to the next wing.
Thank you, Tina. I think that was a pertinent example of Netflix, and I'm glad you also spoke about GE, because that GE is a classic case of, again, another organizational change when Jack Welch brought in Six Sigma, and though the concept was there in its nascent stages, for an entire organization, right from process associates to the CEO, everyone adopting and adapting to Six Sigma and ensuring that your defects are extremely minimal, which means everything that a person did in the organization, right from turning on the computer, talking to people, answering calls, what kind of words you use, everything called for a huge change. And I think it's that appetite to absorb change that leads to success, which brings me to the next question to you, Brilliant. Would you be able to give us a few examples of any organizational wide change that you've encountered or seen in your career?
Two, in fact, one BC, one AD, before Corona, after 2 doses of vaccine. So I would actually sing those were the best days of my life today if I had that music in the background. One of the most interesting assignments that I worked on was relating to a merger and acquisition. One of the organizations that I worked for, let's say, call it company B, which acquired a company C. A few months later, we got acquired by company A. Look at the trajectory. And there is kahani abhi baki hai mere dost kind of a story. We were struggling to integrate the practices, the policies, and the structure of company C to my company B. Despite spending 2 years of focused efforts, consistent meetings, communication, we tried everything. It was not getting through. And we realized that it was becoming very difficult. And then when company A acquired us, we had another challenge. First, we had to integrate our policies as per company A's policies. Then we had to ensure that my subsidiary, company C, also aligns to me as well as to A. And just when we were getting to that, we got acquired. The company A got acquired by another company, let's call it company M, the master of all. That was a chaos situation and it became so difficult. It started with company C because they had a policy which said free beverages for all through the day. You had a vending machine, you could go there, no questions asked, you could spend time. It was a lavish office, sort of a small Google kind of a setup, but in a small remote place, like not a remote place, I would say, but a small office in Chennai. Best part, free, what we call as tair, curd, buttermilk during the lunchtime. It was a right for every individual and they would demand it if it was not there. Senior managers were allowed to travel business class. And we came from a belief of frugality and cost consciousness, which said no business class unless star mutual fund investments are subject to market risks, right? So those conditions were there. But it became so challenging. Finally, after 3 years of continuous communication, having in-person meeting, giving them the big picture and telling them why it is important, we were able to achieve that integration. So that was one of the interesting BC, before Corona, examples of how an organization change impacted not just us, but also we were a part of the process where we got sucked up by someone else. The second is a recent example in my current organization where we merged multiple brands that we had. We started with a one brand company, and then we realized, okay, we want to differentiate in a particular category, so we need to have a new brand. And it was a conscious call about 3-4 years into the organization's existence that we brought in the new brand. And recently, just after the pandemic sort of settled in and we started coming back to work, we said we need to look at integrating all of it so that for stakeholders, including my learners who are my key, my employees or staff who would want to join me, they need to see me as one organization, not as multiple brands spread across, because everything is getting lost. So unifying that became a challenge, especially because as the panel members have also mentioned about it, it is about what works for me may not work for you. But when I try to bring everything together, everyone says, or mere liye, what is in it for me? How will I personally benefit from it? This change is not good. And that is where we started communication. We started having small group meetings, especially involving the business heads who were getting impacted. And there was a formal sign off, and we all know it is impossible to get 100% sign off. But what was important is they felt happy that we had given them a listening ear, which was more important. We understood what they wanted, and then we told them the need for us to integrate. And in the end, after a lot of to's and fro's, we were able to integrate it under one single brand. But everyone is happy? That's not the true story. Most of them are happy. Some of them will still say it was always good to have those multiple brands because I felt privileged when I was associated with this particular brand. But as they say, dhanda hai, karna padta hai. I would summarize from what Tina said and take it to one step ahead: adapt, adopt, and then you become adept. That is how you can achieve success despite change not being welcomed by everyone. Back to you, Cindy.
You can see the Toastmaster speaking there with adopt, adapt, adapt, and adapt. But that was amazing when you spoke about two different cases, one on companies takeover and one within the organization with brands. As I was envisioning whatever you were talking, there must have been a lot of people issues, a lot of insecurity running in, mainly because we like to think that whatever we're doing is permanent. We like to think we are indispensable, though we know we are not. But there is a comfort zone. There is a sense of security when we think that no one can replace me, which means change management calls a lot about dealing with emotions of the people. Though there are directives from the top management to focus on what benefits the organization. This leads me to the next question, Colin. Yes, so change management, whether it's transformative, whether it's organizational, or whether it's just within a particular department, like you said, you have KPIs, you make it objective, you make it measurable. But at the end of it, it's all about people, because it's the people who are going to implement or respond or even react to your change. So how do you ensure you prioritize people in this entire process?
No, absolutely, Sindhu. In fact, I think, in any change management, particularly in mergers and acquisitions, a scenario, which is what Brilliant just mentioned, I think it is very, very key and very important that people initiatives need to be in sync with the overall long-term business objective of the organization. And of course, there has to be a heart attached to it, because it's important that you're dealing with people, you're dealing with emotions, you're dealing with individuals. You're able to do it in a just and fair manner. And I personally have been through a number of mergers and acquisitions in the past, and I've seen how very carefully, very closely, and with a lot of care, we manage such transactions so that it is smooth and meaningful for the organization, as well as win-win for the people as well. And I think one of the most important things to me, besides, of course, being people initiatives being in sync with an overall long-term strategic business objective, I think the most important thing is also that you have to keep in terms of your annual operating plan. What is this change going to take place on a short term as well as on a long term? And to ensure this becomes more meaningful for everyone around, because due to all the changes, people tend to resist these changes. And how can you best get them all around it? I think the first important thing is an involvement in the entire process. Now you can't really involve every stakeholder, but at least some of the key stakeholders, if you're able to involve them in the decision-making process, that makes the buy-in far more meaningful, far more easier, far more better to implement. If those who are not really part of the large strategic decision, at least if they are involved in the implementation, in the planning part of it, I think it will still help. Because most big deals are signed, big changes are signed at the topmost, at the helm of affairs. But finally, the success needs to get implemented when the rubber hits the ground, right? And so, therefore, how do you implement this entire process seamlessly so that it makes meaningful sense, that the people who decided to integrate the two organizations are able to actually bring success for a longer period of time? So finally, what is in for the organization? It's win-win for the customer, it's win-win for the employees, it's win-win for the organization, and so on and so forth. And I think beyond that, and having been part of some of the acquisitions in pharma as well as in other industries that have been part of it, constant dialogue. And I know Brilliant mentioned this point on communication. Yeah, communication is going to be very, very, very key. So really, I think constant dialogue is going to be very key, more in terms of feedback and in terms of suggestions, so that you're able to get a pulse of the situation, and employees are able to get a pulse of the situation at every point of time in the entire process. So from an overall people perspective, these are some things that are very, very critical to ensure that the change management process is as smooth as ever. Yeah. And basis, I think this prioritization that might take place and initiatives, I think this will ensure better delivery, better deployment, and really success in the entire change management process. Yeah. If I were to summarize that.
Thank you, Colin. I think that's really pertinent, keeping the key stakeholders, because ultimately it's these stakeholders who are going to then filter what is essentially needed and be the bridge between the senior management and people. Like you said, it happens only when the rubber meets the road. And it's very important that the right kind of communication gets trickled down, which some organizations we've seen fail doing it, because all the strategizing happens within the boardroom and people are just, within quotes, informed about the change, which is when they start feeling a lot of resistance, thinking, why was I not included? Why am I being informed rather than being consulted? So thank you very much. Dialogue is essential, and I think it's going to be mutual, right? Listening to each other. Now, there are organizations, I'm sure everyone is planning. We are always taught to expect the unexpected, right? So we always have some sort of scrutiny happening, saying, what is plan B? What if plan A fails? Are you ready with plan B? We've got our disaster recovery plans out there, documented really well. I remember when I was working in London, we had these fire drills, the mock drills. We were not told that these were mock drills, but all of a sudden the siren would just go out blaring loudly. And when we were in conference calls, we just had to hang up and just go and assemble, anticipating that all of us are secured. And at the end, we were told that it's a mock fire drill, because we're all preparing ourselves for change. Despite that, we saw a massive unplanned scenario which hit us in the form of COVID. And then all our plans went astray. Whatever we planned for, whatever was our backup, DRP, for many companies, it may not have worked out. So Tina, my question for you is, then what do? You plan so much. You plan till the T, but at the end of it, there is still something that's unplanned that comes up. Then what do? Would you put people first, or what would be the first steps you would take in case of an unplanned change?
So your change could be in any direction. It could be a change in the environment. It could be a change of, the story that Brilliant mentioned in terms of control. Yeah. So, I mean, that is so beautifully put here that I was just so able to relate to it because we had seen some acquisitions. So it could be in any of these fashions. Whenever you come across a very difficult situation, of course, the typical response for organization is to do is flight or fight. Yeah, but while doing so, of course, I mean, that is something that creates a lot of chaos. To avoid that, what they do is that as an initial response, organizations, they gear up and they identify which are those top 20-30% that really hold and influence the organization. They need not be only your top performers. They could be people who are able to drive change. They're able to influence people and hold them onto the organization. They could be the ones who have a very strong command on the technology or on the skill or on the service that is central to the organization. So you have a top 20-30% which are your critical. I mean, there are different models to explain it. You have the 9-box grid, which indicate, skill versus performance, time versus, depth, etc. So whenever you have a situation where you need to pick up, it's not about people versus business, but you have to always have in place, and like your disaster recovery plan, like your succession plan, you always have your critical list of people ready and available in place. And these are the ones that you will bank on to ensure that the organization stays stable. Because whenever there is change, the last thing that you want is flight management to sit and work around, because panic is something that is the largest thing that has to be controlled within the organization. And when you have, people with different personalities, some of them are, born to stay in an organization and, work in a researcher mode, work in a thinking mode, being given their own space and time, and suddenly having to worry about being challenged by a change management would bring in an element of disturbing your main line of service. So if your key architect for the service that you're providing is somebody who has been with you for almost 10 years, nobody really challenges what he does, but the line of insight that they bring in is what is being presented to your clients. So you want to make sure that this person's, way of thinking does not change with these changes in environment coming through. And that is why it is very important to stay connected, to reach out and have different kind of benefits in place. It could be in the form of either your long-term investment plans, LTIPs organizations give, special bonuses or retention plans to ensure that this critical set will stay with you, and they will ensure that there is a ripple effect within the organization. Because it is finally this kind of influence that will ensure that the entire network stays and you have capability staying with an organization. Because of course, yes, I mean, I would speak this largely of service related organizations where it is very people dependent, where your inventory is working in and out of the organization. Yeah, for such organizations, it's very important that your key or critical people stay in, and that is what is going to actually be the make or break of any kind of change management.
Thank you, Tina. What was really deep about what you said was, here you don't look at the top performers alone. You're looking at people who can influence. I think that's a revelation, because many times when you look at people achieving their goals, when you look at KPIs, ultimately it also comes on performance management. Who are my top performers? Who can lead change? Who is capable? So capability many times is measured in terms of performance or achievement of certain goals. So I'm really happy you said it's not only about top performers, but certain influencers. Maybe they have a trait or the ability to bring people together, or they have some innate resilience that we've seen, which can take people further. So thank you for that. I think that's a wonderful point that you made on change management. So back to you, Brilliant. I'm still thinking about those two stories that you said, and especially the first story about these three companies which are taking over each other. And you mentioned about this company where people were so used to getting that extra cup of dahi during lunchtime, which is a big part of culture, though it might seem very trivial. It's actually a big part of culture where I'm able to get that extra cup of dahi and I don't have to ask anyone, I don't have to pay for that. Now, when it comes to change or mergers or acquisitions, there's now going to be which organization is going to follow which organization's values, whose values are going to stay in for a long time, or whose culture are people going to follow. So how do you manage all these sorts of factors around culture during organizational changes?
Thank you. And that's a fantastic question. To be very honest, it brings me to that teacher who said, Kehna kya chahte ho bhai? And that's what happens, right? If we look at any change that happens in an organization, this is the response that we get from people who are affected. And I would say this is because the need for change was not communicated effectively or was not known. Sometimes change is planned, sometimes it is unplanned. But what is important and critical is to make sure that there is the right amount of communication and direction in which we need to move. Whatever is in our control, we need to control the controllables. Just look at what COVID did to us, right? Work in itself changed. So today, if I were to look at it, my staff is operating 100% from office. And that's the need because we are directly linked to the business. The business wants us here. We would want to connect with people. Work gets done at the click of a snap of a finger. In the virtual world, you had to wait for that red to change to yellow or a green. And then you ping and say, suddenly you see the red. So you're not sure. The availability became a challenge. So I think from operating in a mode where we had dependency on technology, one of the things that we need to look at from a culture perspective is also to see how do we bring in flexibility at the same time have the control. Now, it's a oxymoronic statement to say flexible hai but fir bhi control hai. But that's a big change from a culture perspective to focus on a digital way of delivery. Yes, there will be need for teams to operate in office. There are certain positions which could operate from anywhere in the world, but when there is a need, there is a need. Say, for example, the healthcare workers, the doctors, for all that we were thankful for during the COVID, they could never say, right, I could operate from home and succeed. Some of them could. Virtual, what you call as consultations were there, but you can't do a virtual operation. You need to be there. And that is where I feel when we think of a change, what is important for us is to start thinking about digital transformation in the way the culture also behaves. Now, a culture is made up of a lot of things, and I don't need to get into it. Many of us are still to start. Most of us have moved to a digitally transformed organization, but if you look at the majority, we are still to reach there. There are so many aspects of organizational elements like R&R for that matter, L&D, town halls, how I connect with people. I love to meet people. I'll be very honest. I love to meet people. I feel the energy when I am talking to people. But in a virtual world, somehow it gets lost. How do I bring in that positivity in a virtual world as well to make sure that there is the kind of engagement? I would say we need to start with the right goals. We start with a goal, but is it the right goal? We need to build not just strategic plans, but also tactical plans, making sure that all stakeholders are given a say. Every single time we see that, oh, I had a fantastic strategy. What happened to that? It didn't take off. Why? Because the execution plan was never built in. The tactical plan was never there. So it's like operation successful, patient. So it cannot be a truth for HR practitioners. And I would say one aspect where we as practitioners and HR professionals need to be geared for is planning for resistance management. Resistance is unavoidable. Whether it is for the best of the organizations, whatever you bring in, there will be resistance. People will not like. 100% acceptance is never possible. But if we are able to do it, give them the comfort, give them a listening ear. I mentioned about it. Make them feel valued. Make them see the big picture. That is when I think we can achieve a level of success in moving from just a strategic plan to a tactical plan, which is at least X% successful. And taking on from what we discussed earlier, Tina and even Colin spoke about it, keeping focus on people as priority without compromising on the processes. What can help us achieve success is remember the purpose. If we are able to align to the purpose, then I don't think there will be any conundrum about whether it's a people element that I need to look at or the process element that I need to look at. And I think that can help solve a lot of problems, specifically from a cultural standpoint. Back to you.
Thank you, Brilliant. When you mentioned about making people feel valued, I think you hit the nail on the head, because ultimately it's about, I will do something when I know that I'm an integral part of this organization. And it need not be monetary rewards. I just know that I'm valued. I know that people know I'm capable of something and I'm contributing value. And that itself provides that intrinsic inspiration for people to not show resistance to change. I think one great example is, I'm a huge fan of the Tatas, and do a lot of reading on Tatas. And I think one great example of this, what we call the sense of belonging, when people say, this is my company, these are my customers, these are my colleagues, this is my organization. When every employee starts thinking like the entrepreneur, that's the ultimate sense of belonging. And then the classic case was when 2611 happened at the Taj Hotel. We found employees forming a human shield out there to protect the guests. Now, nobody was there on the ground training them or telling them, but this just happened instantly. And I think that's more about how people started feeling that I am contributing to this hotel and I am an intrinsic part of the value chain. And like you said, when I start feeling valued, that filtration of whatever change has to happen will just happen automatically. So again, because I said Tatas, and I think it's just a coincidence, Colin, can you give us an example of any transformative changes? Tatas are known for transformations, but can you give us any stories or examples of transformative changes you've seen?
Absolutely, Sindhu. In fact, the story that you just narrated about the Taj, I think those are intrinsic values that employees have been instilled with at the time of their joining, and I think all that came out. So no one was told, what to do in a situation like this. They just did it because they felt it was right. Yeah, but coming to your specific question, through my career, I've really had the fortune to work on some large M&As when I was with Pharma. This was pre-Tata, of course, but nevertheless, I'd be happy to share some of my experiences. But I think, I wanted to first mention that HR plays a very, very critical role in the success of the merger and acquisition. And I think that is one of the big transformation changes that have been taking place, across the world globally when we looked at organizations integrating to each other. And if I were to break up this process broadly, and classify this, I think there are two parts of it. One is, if I were to classify the first transformational change and communication thereof, which is the pre-aspect, which is actually when a deal is agreed and signed off, and it is put up for regulatory approvals and things like that. And we are seeing certain things that are already taking place, but I don't want to comment on those right now. And the second is about post, when the acquisition is complete and the merged entity is in the process of settling down, which is probably something like 18 to 24 months post, the entire integration takes place. So I mentioned, the HR plays such a critical role. And so therefore, what are some of the areas where, HR can ensure that this change becomes far more smoother? I think one of the most important aspects, and not only through HR, it's also from the leadership team, is ensure regular communication through the entire process. And I think what Brilliant mentioned, upbeat communication, I can't agree more than that, because that's so very important. The more people know, the more you're able to bring down the anxiety and the anxiety levels with people. The second, to my mind, I think is HR to be a very important part of the entire due diligence process, because there's an entire process that's being done, and HR needs to be in a very important aspect to be part of that. And I think in the mergers and acquisitions that I've been part of, there has been a very critical role that HR has played during this entire process. Retention, Why would really companies want to come together, or why would transformations, really want to fructify? And I think this is most important because you want to look at certain key people who can actually take that organization to the next level. And during this situation where you have a bit of uncertainty, how are you able to retain some of the key people during this process? I think that, to my mind, retention is very, very important, which will actually deliver success of this entire change. Because if your major pillars fall off during the transformation process, you probably would not end up where you want it to be. So besides retention, of course, when you look at an overall employee benefits, I think harmonization of employee benefits and things like that. And of course, the other important aspect of how quick this process is able to move. Because a lot of uncertainty would create a little bit of shift in the employees that are there. So therefore, how swiftly this entire process moves demonstrates synergies that will get created, post the entire transformation takes place. So what are the kind of synergies that we will see once this entire process is complete? And of course, create, and I think, Billion just mentioned about how do you really build, create, and nurture a culture of transformation, post-transformation, and how the new scenario would look like. I think these, to my mind, I think are going to be very, very critical in ensuring the success of an entire process and an entire transformation that could take place.
Great, Colin. So I think the crux of what you said is then when HR forms an integral part of transformative change management, it's important that HR thinks proactively, because you spoke about retention. Who's going to stay with me till we roll out the change and even after the change? And what can trigger this person to leave the organization? That's important, because then we start becoming very conscious about the kind of communication we're rolling out. We become mindful about a lot of processes and practices when we start anticipating the worst. And like you said, HR is the key for these kind of integration and change management, because it's all about people. And how do I nurture and keep the morale high despite whatever happens? It's like going into the battlefield, right? No matter what happens, we're all one. We're all together. So thank you so much, Colin. That was enlightening. And just as a derivative of what Colin said, yes, we plan. And of course, there are certain responses. You have the key people who are in together. They're very passionate about it. They share the same vision. But outside that, there could be people who might not share the vision of change, especially in terms of mergers or acquisitions. They might be people who might not resonate with the values of the organization that's taking over this organization. So, Tina, question for you is, what are the different kinds of responses one might encounter during such changes?
So, of course, responses are all dependent on the employee's personality and the personality of the group also, because one is you will definitely see something explosive coming. Some people are very matter of fact and they take it, and there is really no impact. But what's really important on this is how do we, and it has come across even what the other panelists have, how Colin and Brilliant have also said, in fact, you also mentioned, in terms of how the message goes out to the employee. Finally, when you are delivering this message across, that conviction and that that confidence needs to be there on giving that employee or giving the entire organization the input that this is what is going to happen and this is the change that we are going to take up. In fact, this message has to be reiterated till the employee becomes comfortable with that change. Because any change is always going to bring in an element of discomfort, because it might have to do away with what you're used to, or you're comfortable doing it that way. Now you need to learn something new. You might have to let go of your privileges, etc. So it's extremely important that this is completely in the hand of the organization rather than the employee, because an employee will respond based on how he or she best team fit. But it's completely left to how the organization takes it. And the organization must also trust that the employee will also be extremely, see, because finally the employee is also working extremely diligently for the organization. So the organization must also trust that the employee will deal with it the right way. And of course, yes, I mean, we've had cases where some of them, become extremely, vociferous about it, speak about it to their team members, gang up the whole team and get them together and have a discussion. So these are instances that are bound to come and which any organization would be prepared to face. But what's really important is that the organization must take the first step forward of informing the employee beforehand itself, because that at least puts the ball in the court of the organization, where you are telling the employees that we trust you. We trust you with the fact that you would be able to cope with this information. And the organization has to reiterate, because unless you don't talk about that message on and on again, it is not going to get internalized. So if you are used to running, your work in a particular way, and now suddenly you have to change the pace at which you have to work or the modality in which you have to work, then of course, yes, somebody has to sit and reinforce that message time again. So it's completely to the organization and how they take it. Employees would respond, in their fashion, but finally employees come back to terms and they will join the organization.
Thank you, Tina. So consistent and continuous communication is the key then, like you said, to ensure that people don't get fizzled out and also to reinforce the trust. So thank you so much. It's been an interesting conversation with all the three of you. A quick summary. We started off with a brilliant talking about continuous engagement, upbeat messaging, and investing time, which actually set the tone for the conversation on how we can manage change. Colin gave us a lot of KPIs on measuring, more specifically on adherence to project plan. What are the sort of deviations? Are we working according to plan? What are the ROIs, especially in terms of training, especially during change management? Tina, you spoke about freezing the old behaviors and then encouraging new behaviors, which also is change by itself. We also saw quite some examples and stories of organizational and transformative changes, people's response to change, how HR is crux and integral to the entire process of change management, how we can influence people, how we can enforce trust, reinforce the message, and how we can incorporate due diligence working onto strategic and tactical plans. Thank you very much. It's been a fantastic conversation, and I'm sure all of us would like to listen to more on these topics and change management. So before we wind up the session, I would also like to hand it over to Faisal. Faisal, I think, wants to roll out a poll before we open up to the audience for any questions from your side.
Yes, Chandu. So before we move on to the Q&A round, we'll be running a poll to have the participants' valuable feedback on this session. During this time, we request all the participants to feel free and put their questions in the chat window. We will wait for a few seconds in case we're getting any questions. So there's one question that has come up from Pooja. Sindhu, if
Yes, there's one question. How can leaders foster a personal sense of ownership during the change communications? This is from Pooja C. So I'll open it up to any of the panelists who wants to pick up this question. How can leaders foster a personal sense of ownership during the change communications?
Colin, you want to go
Yeah.
or should I?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was just trying to check whether my mute button was on. Yeah. So Pooja, I think, one thing, and I think this is something that I've experienced, where during a large global change management process that's taken place, I think a large part of the responsibility actually stays with the CEO, where communication of various aspects of the entire process is actually rest with them. I think that ownership makes a big difference, because it's nothing better than hearing it from the top, because I think that gives more authenticity, more reliability, and more transparency in the entire communication. So I think the leader, the CEO of the organization has, in the process that I worked with earlier, has taken ownership on the entire process and has communicated himself the entire various stages of the entire process. And I think that has gone in a very positive way, a very positive response from every employee in terms of, how this entire process has been handled so smoothly and so effectively. So that's a little bit from my side. Brilliant. I think you all wanted to mention something as well.
I was saying you had a great example, so I was wondering if you wanted to take it.
Thank you, Colin. Do we have time for one more question, Faisal?
Yes, we have time for one question.
Great. So we have a question from Aditi Verma. What are the major contingency factors that affect organization design?
It's theory, actually. If you were to look at it, it starts from your strategy. It talks about people. It talks about how effectively you communicate, what kind of a technology you have. What we tend to forget about in the whole aspect, which is not covered in the books, is the aspect of emotions and how it impacts individuals. And I think that's one area where if we are able to bring in some kind of a method to the madness, I think that element can probably give us a foot in the door towards making the change and the design effective. Today, most of the design that we talk of, the tools that we talk of, do not factor in the emotional connect that a person would have with a particular organization. May take the example of that buttermilk that I gave you, right? Buttermilk is just a metaphor. I think that buttermilk is what differentiates an employee considering me as a great employer to someone says, yaar, yahan pe buttermilk nahi milta, company ka culture theek nahi.
Yeah, thank you.
Very beautifully put.
Thanks.
Because like you said, at the end of the day, it's about people. Everything is about people when it comes to organizations. And if emotions are not being taken into consideration, then that can actually lead the organization astray. It can put our plans to disaster, because like we said, no matter what we plan, at the end of the day, if people are not receptive to change, then we had it. Is there time for one more question, Faisal,
Yes.
or do we wind up?
No, we can take the question.
How does hierarchy in authority and accountability help in running an organization? This is from Miki Srivastava. How does hierarchy in authority and accountability help in running an organization?
So I'll take this question. So, and this is something that I talk about very often with my team also, where, I mean, organizations have evolved this, and Amazon is actually a fantastic example on this, where, the kind of structure that they have in place is extremely top-down driven, but it is also fluid, similarly in nature. And that's the reason you would have seen, this organization growing by another similar like Netflix by almost 300-500% over the last 10-15 years. And that is because there is a central team that actually takes care of taking key decisions, maybe in the line of talent, in the line of the finances, in the line of technology, and in the line of information management. So while you have certain center of excellences being created or certain departments that lead these areas, this is the key team that will help disseminate things. But from there onwards, you would have seen in large organizations or even in small niche organizations also, they create cohorts or groups based on different factors such as geography, or it could be the line of services, or it could be the nature of services or the size of the service. So let's say some organizations have one large client which accounts for 60% of the revenue, and the remaining 40% is actually taken care by almost 30 other clients. All right. So this is one way in which they create a fluid structure through which this design has been created. Now, if you ask me, is this actually hierarchy? I would say that it is more of hierarchy. That is, how is it that your network within the organization has come or has brought you all to come to understand and to finalize that let's not look at the organization hierarchy as a matter of number of years, but let us look at what really dominates and makes it easier to provide a service to the client. Now, let's say, for instance, if you're saying that Amazon has different lines of services. They have on the internet, they have supply chain, they have warehouses, then they have retailers. So if they really go by the size of each one of this, then it'll be very difficult for them to manage the organization. So then they go by, let's say, looking at different areas such as geographies, or they look at certain capabilities and skills. And that's the reason where fluidity at the second level is extremely important. And that hierarchy actually helps you to figure out, what is really relevant today. If in one organization geography makes sense, then in another organization, possibly line of services or capability will make sense. So that is the kind of tacit information that is available within the organization, where they will need to decide that how do we create these units within the organization to run it seamlessly. Because if you go by the standard, number of years of experience and taking it through to the next level, they're never going to survive. And that's where you will see a lot of instances of organizations that really have come up because at the second level, that fluidity completely contains or exists based on the kind of what is you actually making organization structures based on what is prevalent. So that is known through the informal networks within the organization, and that's what the millennials believe in today. I mean, nobody is really looking at, calling anyone sir, or even a cabinized structure of operating, right? That's how organizations are structured now, where you have cohorts that are built in with diverse backgrounds, with different levels of experience. Okay, so these are cohorts that are built in that actually create these centers of excellence to define how the organization should operate. And that's extremely important on how it'll help define the organization run well.
Thank you, Tina, for defining fluidity in terms of hierarchy, because that beautifully explains why it's not important only to look at who holds power within the organization. So great. It's been wonderful interacting with all the three of you. Brilliant, Colin, Tina. Thank you so much for your time, for your valuable inputs. This is one panel discussion I really enjoyed. Again, I'm going to borrow Tina's words. A lot of fluidity in the conversations, just led one question to another. So on behalf of HRAI, again, we wish you a very happy new year. Thanks to the audience for your patient listening and for your interactive questions. I'm sure the insights that the panelists have brought in are major takeaways that we can take back to our organizations as well. Thank you very much. And again, a wonderful new year to all of you. Over to you, Faisal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sindhu,
for taking us through this session and making it interactive and exciting. Thank you, Dr. Brilliant, Mr. Colin, and Ms. Tina for sharing your valuable thoughts and insights with us. It has been a privilege having you all for this engrossing session. To all those who wish to learn and grow, you can access the recording of our today's session on our YouTube link shared in the chat window. Before we conclude with today's session, we would also want to thank all the event partners, Geisha, NASCOM COE, Talgro, TLE, WICCI, LinkedIn Local Ahmedabad, and India for supporting HREI's events. To know more about these associations, request you to kindly visit the link provided in the chat window. Do join us for our next Connecting the Dots on the topic Future of Work on 19th January 2023. That's it from our today's webinar. Hope to see you soon. Stay safe, take care, and bye for now. Thank
Bye
you.
everyone. Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Thanks,
Thanks,
Edwin.
Colin.
everybody.
Thanks, Tina.
Moderated.
Thanks.